You can be completely justified in defending your life and still end up in prison for it. We're going to walk through exactly when the law says deadly force is justified, and just as important, when it stops being justified. Before we get into it, 3 things. First, I'm not a lawyer. I'm a DOJ-certified use of force instructor who teaches this to CCW applicants and permit holders across the country, and this is the exact framework I use in class. Second, check your local laws. Self-defense law varies state by state. What I'm giving you is the framework and the underlying legal test that most states use in some form. But the specific definitions and statutes vary state to state. So take this as your foundation, then go verify the specifics for where you live. Third, I'm giving you what is or isn't justified, not what should or shouldn't be justified. I'm not here to talk politics or philosophy. I'm a use of force expert, and what I'm about to teach you is how this actually works in a courtroom, what the prosecutor is going to look at, and what keeps you out of prison. So let's start with the baseline. Before you can even consider using deadly force, you have to be facing a deadly threat. Not a threat, not something that made you uncomfortable, a deadly threat. What does that mean? A deadly threat is a threat of death or what's called great bodily harm. Sometimes you'll hear it called grave bodily harm depending on the state. And you have to have what's called a reasonable belief that you're facing one of those 2 things. Now, the exact definition of great bodily harm is going to vary state to state, but generally, we're talking about an injury that's crippling or disfiguring or serious enough to require hospitalization. We're not talking about a black eye, we're not talking about a bruised ego, we're talking about serious, lasting harm or your life. That's the floor. If you're not facing that, deadly force isn't on the table yet. Everything else we're about to cover is how the law decides whether you were actually facing that. How do you actually prove you were facing a deadly threat? The courts break it down into specific elements, and I want to walk you through each one because this is the real test. Element 1, means or ability. This is asking, did the other person actually have the ability to kill you or seriously hurt you? Usually people think about this as a gun. Somebody's got a gun pointed at you, that's an obvious means. But it doesn't have to be a weapon. It can also be what's called a disparity of force, meaning the other person or people had such an overwhelming physical advantage that even empty-handed, they had the ability to seriously hurt or kill you. We're going to come back to disparity of force in a lot more detail in a minute because it's a big topic on its own. But I want you to know it lives right here under means and ability. And here's the part you have to remember through all of this. It's not enough for you to just feel like the threat had the means. You have to be able to articulate it. Articulate meaning you can explain it out loud after the fact in a way that makes sense to someone who wasn't there. I don't know, I just felt scared. That's not going to cut it. He was 6'7" and 350 pounds of muscle and about to pummel me into the ground. I'm 5'6" and 140 pounds. That's articulable. That's a reasonable belief you can actually explain because one punch from someone like that could potentially kill you or give you traumatic brain injury. Element 2, opportunity. This one's about whether the threat is imminent and unavoidable. Oftentimes, this can come down to distance. Somebody screaming a threat at you from across a parking lot doesn't have the opportunity to act on it just yet. Somebody 3 feet away with a knife does. That same person across the parking lot put an AK-47 in their hand and the situation changes because now they have the opportunity to cause you serious harm. The threat has to be right now, not 5 minutes from now, and it has to be something you simply can't walk away from. Element 3, jeopardy or manifest intent. This is about intent. You'll sometimes hear it called manifest intent. Is this person actually acting like they're about to hurt you? Are they moving toward you, reaching for something, making it obvious through their actions that they intend to follow through? Somebody standing still with their hands in their pocket, even after saying something threatening, might not meet jeopardy. Someone charging at you with a weapon raised absolutely does. So you need all 3. Means, the ability to hurt you. Opportunity, the chance to actually do it right now at a distance where it's real. Jeopardy or manifest intent, they're actually acting on it. Miss any of those 3 and you don't have a deadly threat just yet, at least not in the eyes of the law. And then there's a fourth piece, and this one's about you, not them. It's called standing. Standing deals with your own conduct in the encounter. To be justified, you have to be the innocent party. You didn't start it, you didn't provoke it, you didn't escalate it. If you're the one who threw the first punch or the first insult that turned physical, standing gets a whole lot harder to claim. On top of that, no lesser force could have stopped the threat. If a stern warning or pulling out pepper spray or simply stepping back could have ended it and you went straight to deadly force instead, that's a problem. And finally, there was no way to escape without putting yourself or somebody else in harm's way. If a door was right there and you could have walked out safely but chose not to, that's going to come up. Yes, we're going to talk about stand your ground and duty to retreat in just a second, but still, if you could have walked away from an encounter and you didn't, it will come up. If what I'm explaining feels confusing, it's because it is. In an encounter where split seconds matter, your adrenaline is through the roof, and you can't think straight, training becomes everything. That's when you have to make sure with the right training that you are just simply reacting correctly and not doing things instinctually, because a lot of times instinct is not legal. That's why the Confident Defender program exists. It's a 12-week one-on-one program designed to get you there. If you haven't heard about it, links in the pinned comments, so go and check it out. It's an outstanding program designed to get you from where you are to where you can effectively defend yourself legally and effectively. All right, let's go back to disparity of force because I told you we'd come back to it, and this is one of the most misunderstood concepts in self-defense. Disparity of force means the fight was never fair to begin with, so much so that even without a weapon, the other side had the ability to seriously hurt or kill you. And just like with means and ability, you have to be able to articulate why, not just feel it, explain it. So what actually counts? Numbers. One person defending against 3 or 4 attackers is a very different situation than 1 against 1. Strength. A significant difference in size or physical strength between you and the other person. Age. A 25-year-old and a 65-year-old are not on equal footing, and the law recognizes that. Injuries or disabilities. This one's interesting because it can be something you already had going into the encounter or something that happens during the fight itself. A shoulder gets dislocated, a knee gives out, and suddenly you can't defend yourself the way you could 10 seconds earlier. Here's a detail a lot of people miss. Even if the other person has no idea you have that injury or disability, it still counts towards your disparity of force claim. But, and this is a big but, it is monumentally better for you if that disability is documented before the incident ever happens. A pre-existing medical record is a lot more convincing than you explaining it for the first time to a detective after the fact, or your lawyer sending you to a doctor later to show this injury existed. And one more that surprises people: male versus female. The law generally assumes a woman can be overpowered by a man. That assumption alone can be a disparity of force factor even without any others present. So the rule of thumb, if someone breaks into your house at 2 in the morning, is to send your wife downstairs because she can shoot and you cannot. Just kidding. This is a joke. Do not do that. This is a joke. This is a joke. This is a joke. And then there's a broader category. Other factors. This includes any prior history between you and the other person, and it includes the other person's history of previous violence or criminal behavior, if that's something you were aware of at the time. If you knew this person had a documented history of violent assaults, that's relevant to whether your fear was reasonable. Here's the thing to understand about disparity of force. It's not a technicality and it's not a loophole. It's the law recognizing that deadly force isn't only justified against the weapon. Sometimes the person or the people are the weapon. Now let's talk about 2 terms you've probably heard and some of the misconceptions around them: stand your ground and duty to retreat. Stand your ground means that in a place where you're legally allowed to be and you're not involved in any illegal activity, you have no legal obligations to retreat before using force, even if retreat was possible. You can hold your position and defend yourself. So these are the 2 major things to consider. Number 1, you have to have the legal right to be there. Public parking lot, public sidewalk, so and so. Number 2, you're not involved in an illegal activity. You're not standing on the public sidewalk putting graffiti on the wall or throwing rocks at passing cars. Duty to retreat is the opposite approach. Some states require that if you can safely retreat, You have to try before force becomes legally justified. Here's the nuance a lot of people miss on duty to retreat. Safely is doing a lot of work in that sentence. You're not required to retreat if it cannot be done safely. And you're also not required to retreat if doing so would leave somebody else, a family member, a stranger, anybody, in danger. The law isn't asking you to save yourself by abandoning someone else to the threat. So even in a duty to retreat state, if retreat isn't actually safe, or it means leaving someone behind, that duty doesn't apply. The opposite is also true. In a state with stand your ground laws, if you had an obvious and safe means of avoiding the conflict and you didn't take it, it's going to raise questions. The point here is, don't let your ego get in the way of making decisions. We see this come up time and again where someone stays in a situation because their ego is preventing them from making the right decision and get out of there. And then they end up using deadly force and get in trouble for it. When it comes to self-defense, your ego is not your amigo. Which law applies to you depends entirely on your state. So this is exactly the kind of thing you need to check locally. Getting this backwards, thinking you're in a stand your ground state when you're actually in a duty to retreat state, is exactly the kind of mistake that turns a justified defense into a criminal charge. But I have a cheat code for you that can be applied nationally, anywhere, in any state. If you can safely retreat, then take that option. You win 100% of the fights you avoid. Deadly force encounters are extremely risky and unpredictable. You cannot know if you will win the fight, so if you can avoid it safely, take that option. I get this question all the time from my students where they explain a certain situation and then they ask me, can I shoot in this situation? And my answer is always the same. Can I is the wrong question. Your question should be, should I or must I? Does your life or the life of someone you kiss goodnight actually depend on whether or not you shoot? And if the answer to that question is yes, then shooter ready, stand by, and off you go defending yourself. The other really good analogy I've heard is what we call the Shark Tank analogy. Imagine you're standing next to a tank full of angry, hungry sharks and your expensive Rolex watch suddenly falls in there. Are you going to jump in there and get it? Is the expensive Rolex worth your life? I think most of us answer, heck no. Now let's change this up a little bit. If God forbid your kid falls in there, will you jump in there? And again, I think here most of us would think that we would absolutely do that. The same should be true of getting involved in a gun battle. This might be the most important part of the whole video because it's the part that trips people up even after they did everything else right. In most places, drawing your gun and using your gun are held to the same legal standard. A lot of people think drawing is a lower stakes decision, almost like a warning, and that firing is the real decision. Legally, that's not how it works, at least in most jurisdictions. There are some states where you're allowed to do what's called a defensive display. That is to show or draw your gun to avoid a conflict. And in another video sometime in the future, I'm going to explain why even in those states, that's a monumentally poor decision to make, even if the law allows for it. So please click the subscribe button if you're not already a subscriber and hit that notification button so that when we post new content, you'll hear about it. That way you can know when that video is up. Defensive display is a strategic and tactical mistake, even if it's legal in your state, but it's beyond the framework of this video. In most jurisdictions, displaying a firearm is a crime called brandishing, which is basically making a threatening gesture with a firearm. So when it comes to drawing your firearm, the same circumstances that justify drawing or pointing a firearm at someone are generally the same circumstances required to justify pulling the trigger. If you're not legally justified to shoot, you're generally not legally justified to draw and point either. Second, it's not a one-time decision, it's continuous. The moment you draw, you have to keep reassessing. Is this still a deadly threat? Is means, opportunity, and jeopardy still present right now this second? And if you do fire, that reassessment doesn't stop after the first shot either. You are required to keep evaluating shot by shot whether continuing to use force is still appropriate. Sounds like a lot? It's because it is, and it's serious. It can get you tripped up, and the Confident Defender program is exactly the type of program that trains you on how to respond correctly and effectively in a deadly force situation. Link is in the pinned comments if you have not heard of that program and if you would like to learn more about it. It's a 12-week one-on-one program designed to get you to the skill level and understanding to be able to defend yourself legally and effectively. And here's the part that ends careers and puts people in prison even after a justified shoot. You have to stop using force the moment the deadly threat is over. The second the person is down or disarmed or running away and the threat stops, your legal justification to use force ends. In a lot of jurisdictions, if you keep going past that point, something remarkable happens legally. The roles reverse. The original attacker, the person who started this whole thing, now has the legal right to defend themselves against you because now you're the one using unjustified force. Think about that for a second. You can go from being the legally protected party to being the legal aggressor in the same encounter just by continuing too long. So I understand the predator drive that kicks in and nudges you to continue engaging or chasing after an attacker, but you have to actively fight that instinct and stop the moment the threat is over. As private citizens, our job is to break contact, so when it's possible, take that option. So don't give your attacker the opportunity to turn tables on you. The fight isn't over when you feel like it's over. It's over when the threat is actually gone. Of course, there are myriad nuances that come into play in all areas we just talked about. We simply can't talk about everything in a simple YouTube video. This is exactly the kind of material we go through in depth inside the Confident Defender program. Because understanding the law isn't optional homework, it's half of being prepared. If you want to see what that actually looks like, links in the pinned comments. And if you carry, go watch the concealed carry mistakes video next, because half of what we just covered here is exactly why those mistakes matter as much as they do. Thank you for watching. Keep your powders dry and protect what's priceless.